New details this afternoon as the two parents accused of abusing and murdering their newborn baby appeared in court in Norfolk this morning.
Zabria Parker and Hillary Johnson II were arrested in May on charges of second-degree murder and child abuse. Our Jemiah Beatty was in the courtroom, so we do want to warn you, some of the details of this case are disturbing.
Welcome to Shocking True Crime. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for daily updates on the most shocking true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
May 4, 2024. A quiet afternoon at the Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters. The emergency doors swing open. A father, eyes filled with dread, carries his tiny, limp daughter. Ijaya. 9 days old. Her body, cold to the touch. What happened to this baby? A fall from a stroller? A tragic accident? Or is something far darker at play here? In a case that shook Virginia to its core, the truth behind a newborn's tragic death would be uncovered, layer by layer. In this documentary, we will unravel the dark truth of how Ijaya's life was stolen. Hillary, an avid jogger. Zabria, a young mother, trying her best to care for her newborn. Their lives, like their home, were built on shifting sands. There was no promise of security, no guarantee of better days ahead. This, however, was the world they'd brought their daughter into. The world that would ultimately shape her short life. In a tent, amidst the chaos of unmet needs and unspoken fears, their fragile family did what they could to survive. Every day was a battle, not just for food, but for the emotional warmth a newborn so desperately needs. But a child doesn't deserve a life like this. A newborn doesn't deserve to be brought into a world of instability. No child should be born into neglect, into a life where love isn't the first thing they feel, where pain, instead of protection, is their inheritance. But despite their hardships, a newborn was brought into their world, a gift of life. But for Ijaya, what would she inherit? A mother's love or a life of neglect and pain? Hillary's journey, like Zabria's, was one shaped by a difficult environment. Raised in a world where survival often meant making hard, often poor decisions, he had dreams of something more, something better. But those dreams often collided with his reality, a reality where the path forward seemed murky at best. Could Hillary overcome his past? Could he change the trajectory of his life? Or was he trapped by the very struggles that had defined him? For Zabria, motherhood was supposed to offer a fresh start, a reason to rise above the chaos. But with her own history, marked by instability, uncertainty, and a lack of resources, could she truly provide what Ijaya needed? Was she prepared for the weight of this responsibility? Or was she simply doing the best she could with the little she had? Hillary, a man caught between the hope of a better life and the pull of his past mistakes. Zabria, a mother whose history haunted her decisions, now standing at the crossroads of motherhood and survival. Both of them, bound together in a relationship that was as fragile as the life they tried to create for their daughter. It was a life, one would think, that would be filled with moments of tenderness, of joy, of protection. But instead, it was filled with shadows, shadows of neglect, shadows of pain, and in those shadows, something darker began to take root. It's often said that the first moments of a child's life are the most important, the moments that shape their future. For Ijaya, the future seemed all but uncertain. Brought into a world of instability and hardship, it seemed as though love and protection were the last things she would receive. Instead, she was born into a fight, not just for survival, but for the chance to be loved, to be cared for, to be safe. Yet, what she received instead were the shadows of her parents' struggles. What they had been unable to overcome, she would inherit, the trauma, the uncertainty, the pain. Hillary Johnson and Zabria Parker, in their struggle to survive, had brought a child into a world she wasn't ready for. But could anyone truly be ready for what happened next? A mother, struggling with her past. A father, battling his own demons. Together, they were unprepared for the devastation that was to come. And in the end, that devastation would leave a child, cold to the touch, in the arms of strangers. What happened that fateful day in May? The truth is darker than anyone could have imagined. And it was a truth that, once uncovered, would leave no question unanswered. On the afternoon of May 4, 2024, Ijaya's life would change forever. Hillary's account of the incident was clear: Ijaya had fallen from the stroller while he was jogging. It was an accident, he said, a simple mistake. The kind of thing any parent might fear but never expect to happen to them. The kind of story that, on the surface, seemed plausible. A tragedy that anyone could understand. A fall. An injury. A father who had been caught unaware. But something about their story didn't add up. Why, if it was just a simple fall, did they wait so long to get medical help? Why didn't they rush to the hospital immediately? Instead, Hillary and Zabriya claimed they tried to treat Ijaya themselves. Witch hazel, peroxide, and gauze. Makeshift care for a baby who had been clearly injured. The timing of it all seemed strange. If a baby's life was in danger, why not act faster? They said that they didn't take Ijaya to the hospital sooner because they believed they could handle it on their own. A simple remedy. But as her condition worsened, as her appetite diminished, and as her breath became shallow, they finally made the decision to board the light rail and head to the hospital. By then, it was too late. It wasn't just a fall. It was something worse. Something deeper. When they arrived at the hospital, the staff immediately noticed something was wrong. A child so young, so fragile, shouldn't have injuries like this. A simple fall from a stroller didn't explain the bruises on her back, the cuts on her head, or the burns on her feet. The doctor's suspicions were immediate. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a fall. This was abuse. But the parents were adamant. They stuck to their story, each one maintaining that the injuries were not as serious as they appeared. Yet the evidence couldn't be ignored. There were burns, deep and severe. Not from an accident, but from something far worse. As Ijaya lay there, fighting for life, the truth began to emerge, not through words, but through what was visible on her tiny, defenseless body. Bruises. Cuts. Burns. All signs pointing to something that no parent should ever inflict on their child. The fall story didn't explain everything. How did these injuries happen? How did an innocent baby sustain such trauma? More importantly, who was responsible? As the story continues to unfold, the question remains, how could this have happened? And who will be held accountable for the senseless death of a defenseless child? As Ijaya was rushed to the hospital, the doctors and nurses quickly saw that this was no ordinary injury. The bruises, burns, and cuts all over her tiny body were nothing like a fall from a stroller. There, on the bottom of her feet, were deep, partial-thickness burns. Burns that could only be caused by something far hotter than any stroller. Cuts on her head. Bruises on her back. The kind of injuries that should never be inflicted on an innocent child. The kind of injuries that told a story far more sinister than a simple fall. What they were seeing was far from the result of an accident. A fall from a stroller didn't explain these injuries. There were signs of something much more deliberate, something much darker. This wasn't a parent's mistake. This was abuse. The parents were asked to explain what had happened. They repeated their story, the one about the stroller fall. But as the doctors continued their examination, they realized that the severity of Ijaya's injuries could not possibly be the result of such an accident. There were too many signs. Too many inconsistencies. With each new discovery, each burn, each bruise, each cut, the story began to unravel. What started as a claim of a tragic fall turned into something far more chilling. Something much worse. The injuries, the burns, nothing about them could be explained by a simple stroller accident. There were too many signs of deliberate harm. A mother and father could not possibly fail to see the consequences of such abuse. Could they? In the midst of their fear, something else emerged. A profound sense of dread. The medical staff, now fully aware of the nature of Ijaya's injuries, prepared for the inevitable. The truth could no longer be denied. Ijaya's condition continued to deteriorate. Her heart rate slowed. Her breathing became more labored. Despite all efforts to save her, it was clear, she was not going to survive. The question now was no longer how to save her, but why had this happened? How had this innocent child been brought to this point? Ijaya's fate was sealed. But even as her tiny body lay in the sterile confines of the hospital room, questions remained unanswered. Who did this to her? Who was responsible for this innocent child's suffering? And why had they waited so long to get her the help she so desperately needed? The truth was out there, hidden beneath the surface of their story. And as the hours passed, it became increasingly clear, this wasn't just a tragic accident. This was something far more calculated, far more deliberate. The question was no longer if justice would be served, but when it would be uncovered. And who, in the end, would bear the consequences for Ijaya's death? With the medical examiner's report, the truth began to unravel. Blunt trauma to the head and torso. Deep burns, consistent with hot liquids. Broken ribs. Internal and external injuries. Ijaya's life had been a series of unfathomable horrors, and now, the depth of her suffering was laid bare in the cold, clinical language of the autopsy report. What had started as a simple story of an unfortunate fall from a stroller was now a full-blown investigation into abuse, neglect, and death. But why would a parent do this? What would drive someone to inflict such harm on an innocent child? The detectives were tasked with finding answers. As they approached the couple, questions loomed in the air, unanswered and heavy. Was this the result of a tragic mistake? Or was it something far more intentional, something dark buried beneath the surface? The couple stuck to their story. The fall from the stroller. It was an accident. A tragic mistake. But the evidence was damning. Every question posed by the detectives only deepened the suspicion. Why hadn't they sought medical attention earlier? Why had they waited so long, treating Ijaya's wounds with witch hazel, peroxide, and gauze? Why were they so vague about the exact timeline of the incident? Their answers didn't match the severity of the injuries the baby had sustained. The inconsistencies in their account were glaring, and the detectives couldn't ignore them. As the hours passed, the detectives dug deeper into the couple's past, hoping to uncover the truth that would explain why Ijaya had been treated with such neglect. Were they victims of their circumstances, struggling to survive in an environment where resources were scarce? Or was there something more to their actions, something darker, more intentional? The investigation revealed a pattern of neglect and carelessness. There had been previous instances, small, seemingly insignificant moments, that, when pieced together, painted a disturbing picture. The couple had struggled to provide for Ijaya from the very beginning. No one expected them to be perfect, but the signs were clear. They had been in over their heads, and their neglect had spiraled into something much more dangerous. But could they pinpoint the person responsible for the fatal injuries? Could they determine who, in the end, had inflicted the worst harm on Ijaya? The evidence seemed to point in multiple directions. Both parents were involved, yes, but who had been the one to deliver the final blow? Was it Hillary, the father, whose account seemed to shift with each new question? Or Zabriya, whose evasive answers hinted at a deeper level of involvement? The detectives couldn't make sense of it just yet. There were too many unanswered questions. The couple's story was slowly falling apart, piece by piece. As more and more inconsistencies emerged, the detectives were left with one undeniable truth: someone had hurt this child. Someone had caused her suffering, and they were going to find out who. But even with the mounting evidence, there was still one question that lingered: why? The detectives were getting closer, but the real breakthrough would come soon. And when it did, it would change everything. But for now, the investigation continued, slowly, methodically, like a puzzle waiting to be solved. The autopsy confirmed the suspicions. Ijaya's death was no accident. The injuries she sustained were consistent with abuse. No stroller fall could cause this. What started as a tragic story of a simple fall from a stroller had now evolved into something far darker. Ijaya had suffered, and the nature of her injuries spoke volumes. A simple fall didn't explain the bruises, the cuts, and certainly not the burns. The truth, it seemed, was more terrifying than anyone had anticipated. The medical examiner ruled blunt trauma to the head and torso as the cause of death. But what about the burns? The burns that marked the bottom of Ijaya's tiny feet, deep partial thickness burns, consistent with something far more serious than an accident. The kind of injury you'd expect from a scalding liquid. But where did those burns come from? And who was responsible for inflicting them? Hot liquid. Deep partial thickness burns. The kind of injury you'd expect from a scalding burn. But who inflicted it? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the detective stared at the report. The parents had told their story, the fall from the stroller, but this was no fall. These injuries were deliberate. And the more the detectives uncovered, the more it became clear, this wasn't just a case of neglect. This was abuse, and it was far worse than anyone could have imagined. The investigators' reactions were a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. How could anyone harm a child so brutally? How could a parent, a mother, a father, inflict such harm? The case was no longer just about neglect. It was about cruelty. About the horrifying reality that the couple's carelessness had led to the ultimate tragedy. The medical examiner's findings were clear. The burns, the bruises, the broken ribs, they weren't caused by a stroller fall. They were caused by something else. Something much darker. And as the investigation moved forward, the detectives began to see more and more signs pointing to the parents. But who was the one who had inflicted the fatal injuries? Was it Hillary, or was it Sabriya? Was it one, or both? The investigation was reaching a critical juncture. With each passing day, the story began to unravel further. The evidence pointed to the parents, yes, but who had crossed the line from neglect to brutality? Who was the one who had caused Ijaya's suffering? The detectives couldn't yet say for sure, but they were getting closer. The truth was beginning to emerge. And when it did, it would change everything. The parents' stories were beginning to crack under pressure. The lies they had told, the inconsistencies in their accounts, everything was starting to unravel. They had claimed it was a fall. They had claimed they hadn't acted quickly enough. But with the medical examiner's report in hand, the truth was beginning to become undeniable. There was no way to explain away the burns. There was no way to explain away the bruises. There was no way to explain away the broken ribs. The detectives knew they were getting closer to the truth. And soon, the pieces of the puzzle would fall into place. But even then, the biggest question remained, why? Why had they done this? And who was responsible? The detectives knew the truth was almost within reach. The burns, the bruises, the trauma, everything had pointed to one conclusion. And the parents, now cornered by their own lies, couldn't hold out much longer. The investigation was far from over. But with the medical examiner's findings, the truth had taken its first step into the light. And when it finally emerged in full, the parents would be forced to confront the consequences of their actions. What started as a lie, a simple story of a fall, had turned into a nightmare. The question now was who would pay the price for Ijaya's pain and suffering. Both parents faced charges. But the case was complicated. Hillary denied inflicting the fatal injuries, and so did Sabriya. The evidence pointed to Hillary. The autopsy, the bruises, the burns, all signs that something far more sinister had occurred. But the state couldn't definitively say who had inflicted the fatal injuries. There were moments when the evidence seemed to suggest Sabriya, moments when it pointed toward Hillary. Neither parent was willing to take the blame for the death of Ijaya. The longer the legal battle raged on, the more their stories unraveled, but neither one would budge. And so, the case dragged on, its weight growing heavier by the day. In a heartbreaking turn, both parents accepted plea deals. The stakes were high. If they chose to fight the charges in court, there was a risk of facing harsher sentences. The pressure mounted, and ultimately, both Hillary and Zabria decided to settle for a plea deal. Hillary would no longer face the child abuse charge. Zabria would no longer face the murder charge. But the question still hung in the air, unanswered. Who killed Ijaya? The legal system, with all its complexity, was now offering them a way out. But at what cost? The case, so full of unanswered questions, would now come to a close with a quiet resolution, one that left more questions in its wake. Hillary and Zabria had been given the chance to avoid the full weight of their actions. The plea deal was their escape, but it didn't come without a heavy burden, the guilt, the moral responsibility, and the fact that they had not fully owned the horror of what had been done to their daughter. In the end, Hillary was sentenced to 19 years in prison, while Zabria was sentenced to 10 years. The sentences felt like an eternity for a life lost. A life that was taken before it ever truly had a chance to begin. But in the world of criminal justice, there were no easy answers. There was no perfect resolution. There were only the broken pieces left in the wake of a senseless act, and the heavy weight of the law attempting to impose its will upon it. What had happened to Ijaya was far more than a tragic accident. It was a failure of love, of protection, of care. Her life had been taken too soon, and the court's decision, though final, could not erase the scars left behind. There was no undoing the pain. There was no bringing her back. And as the parents faced the reality of their sentences, the question remained, would they ever truly come to terms with what they had done? Would they ever admit to the brutal truth that had been buried beneath their lies? The legal battle had ended, but for the parents, for the family, and for the memory of Ijaya, the fight was far from over. They had been given their sentences, but they would live with the consequences of their actions for the rest of their lives. And so would the world, for the story of Ijaya, the girl who never had a chance, would remain, lingering in the minds of all who came to know her tragic tale. The day of reckoning had arrived. The court would decide the fate of the parents. The families, the lawyers, the spectators, all waited as the judge prepared to deliver the verdicts. For Hillary Darnell Johnson and Zabria Chantel Parker, the moment they had been dreading was now at hand. The fate of their lives, the fate of their daughter's memory, rested on this decision. The air in the courtroom seemed to thicken with every passing second. A child was dead, and these two parents, who had failed her so profoundly, were about to face the consequences. Hillary Darnell Johnson was sentenced to 19 years. Zabria Chantel Parker was sentenced to 10. A far cry from what Ijaya deserved, but a step toward justice. It was over. Or was it? Could the system have done more? Could they have prevented this tragedy? Ijaya's death was a senseless one, the result of neglect, of cruelty, of a system that failed to protect her when it was needed the most. These two parents, now facing prison sentences, were paying the price. But was the price enough? The parents had been sentenced. Justice had been served, but justice, in this case, could never feel like enough. Ijaya's death had left a void that no amount of prison time could fill. The cruelty of her short life, the violence that stole it from her, could never be undone. The wounds of neglect, of abuse, would never heal for those who loved her, and perhaps, not even for the parents who had failed her so completely. What happens to families like these? What happens to children like Ijaya? In the end, a life was lost, one that had barely begun. Justice, in this case, may have been served, but the question remains, could more have been done? Could Ijaya have been saved from the pain, from the neglect, from the suffering she endured in her short life? Zabria and Hillary will serve their time, yes, but what of the families they left behind? What of the pain that lingers in their wake? What of the children who are still vulnerable, still at risk of being forgotten? The system, as it is, isn't perfect. It isn't infallible. And sometimes, the damage done is irreparable. Ijaya came into the world in need of love, protection, and care. What she got instead was suffering and death. Her story is one of neglect, abuse, and a heartbreaking loss of innocence. For the parents who should have protected her, justice was served, but the pain of what happened will never go away. How do we prevent these tragedies from happening again? How do we protect the innocent? The answer, perhaps, is still out there, waiting to be found.
Welcome to Shocking True Crime. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for daily updates on the most shocking true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe.